Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. My guest today on the Realignment is retired General Frank F. McKenzie. He has a new book out, The Melting Point: High Command and War in the 21st Century. General McKenzie retired from the Marine Corps after holding the commanding role at CENTCOM. He presided over the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the campaign against ISIS, and of course, the killing of Qassem Soleimani in terms of the U.S. conflict with Iran over the Middle East in the early 2020s. He's had a really interesting career and has now written a book that deals with both those events, but also the lessons for our present moment, from the tensions when it comes to civil-military relations to a broader question of the U.S. military's purpose after 20 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Lots of, I think, really helpful frameworks and just history here. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. And of course, a huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation. General Frank McKenzie, welcome to the Realignment.
It's great to be with you here today.
Yeah, great to chat with you, sir. So let's just start here. You served in the Marine Corps for over 40 years and retired as Commander of U.S. Central Command. Can you start by introducing CENTCOM and the responsibilities and scope of that command?
Sure. So Central Command is one of 11 of the nation's combatant commands. There are 11, 7 are geographic, 4 are functional. A geographic combatant command is a combatant command that's responsible for a portion of the earth. In my case, it was 21 nations from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north to Yemen in the south. So 21 nations, 3 of the world's major maritime choke points, the Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Strait of Hormuz, the place where the world's religions come together, and also a place of vast natural wealth and resources, particularly hydrocarbons. A combatant commander is a unique responsibility in the U.S. system. Combatant commanders work for only 2 people in the world. They work for the President of the United States, and they work for the Secretary of Defense. And that is very different than, say, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who, while is the nation's senior military advisor to both the President and the Secretary, is not in the chain of command, or the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Although they run their services, they actually can't direct things to happen in the theaters. They don't actually bear responsibility for the execution of U.S. policy. That is uniquely and solely the responsibility of the combatant commander under the direction of civilian leadership.
Something I'm curious about when it comes to working with presidents, I think when we're evaluating the American experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, we have to separate, let's say, the military implementation aspects of strategy from political decisions that presidents make. So, for example, it is a political decision to invade Iraq. It's a political decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. There is then the implementation on the military side of things when it comes to the advising and actual implementation. Can you talk about how that plays out when you're sitting there as a combatant commander?
Certainly. So on high-level decisions like this, these decisions are ultimately going to be made by the president. The president's going to seek counsel from a number of different people. One of them could be the combatant commander. Doesn't have to, but in the case of the Afghanistan withdrawal, President Biden did seek my counsel on this, and I was able to give him my opinion. So you have an opportunity as national decision makers to formulate their decision. The combatant commander has an opportunity to participate in that process as a junior partner, because the president's also getting advice from his cabinet level secretaries, and he's getting advice from the Secretary of Defense, and of course he's also getting it from the chairman. But you do have an opportunity to weigh in on that process, and you do get to state your opinion. Now ultimately, the president is going to make a decision, and once that decision is made, then the combatant commander will be the person who executes that decision, because lots of people give advice, lots of people execute decisions. Only the combatant commander gives advice and executes decisions. And that's just an important thing to think about. So in the cases you're talking about, certainly you have the opportunity to contribute to the dialogue that goes on. Then a decision is made. Then it's time to carry out the decision of the president.
Something I'm curious about, and you're a person who works to be very apolitical and also work within the space of civil military relations. When you talk about giving your opinion, what do you think as a general is the scope of where your opinion is valid? So for example, let's say President Bush in 2003 says, look, we're going to invade Iraq. I'm sure that the part where your opinion becomes especially relevant in this case, let's say you were a little more advanced in your career, would be, okay, so we need to start in the South and go north versus, okay, maybe we do something different. Maybe we come from the North. Where do the Kurds fit in? How do you really delineate the difference between how your opinion on how a president adopts a strategy versus President Bush's assessment that Iraq was like the next stage of the war on terror, which I think you would probably say would be outside the scope of opinion or advice?
Sure. So for a military commander, you want to stick to what you know. You're a subject matter expert. I know a lot about military capabilities. If we're going to invade Iraq, I know a lot about how we would do that. What's the best way to do it? What are the pros and cons of an advance from the south, from the north, a dual advance, however you want to do it. And so you stick to that. What you don't talk about is global effects. What you don't talk about are the president's domestic issues that he is going to consider, as he or she is going to consider as they make decisions like this. You need to stay completely out of that lane. You need to talk about what you know. And you are the expert on those things. So, and you present the president with different alternatives. You talk about the risks that are associated with that. You enter into a full dialogue on that. Then eventually, you're going to get a decision.
I think what's really interesting, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is I think a lot of civilian or non-military focused folks will look at the sort of post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq hangover and feel a lot of pessimism about the U.S. military. But something that I think is interesting to consider in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is you had numerous examples of rotting tires on their infantry fighting vehicles. You had examples of like deep corruption that wasn't just a bad look as the Navy sort of just went through, but actually deeply impacted operations. So can you maybe talk about the fact that we could have various qualms with our ability to ascertain the proper victory conditions in Iraq and Afghanistan, to implement the political side of the policy properly? But I think the U.S. military over the past 20 years really stands up at an operational level when you're speaking to expertise there. So, and especially in contrast to early Ukraine, Russia. Could you talk about like the various lens of that issue?
Well, first of all, you're exactly right. That's a very clear contrast between the way the Russians fought and went into Ukraine and the way the U.S. military fights. And here's the reason. The U.S. military has in its junior enlisted force, and the sergeants, the staff sergeants, the gunnery sergeants, the sergeants first class, a group of people who are very well trained. They believe in our country, and they're very technically competent. And that's across all the services, whether it's the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Space Force, doesn't matter. And that's unique really to the U.S. Joint Force and to some of our Western allies and a few other nations around the world. But most people don't have that sort of managerial class that actually make things happen. And I'd include junior officers in that as well. And that's where when generals issue orders, where those orders get transmuted into reality is at this level. We're the best in the world at this. And so people come to study the U.S. Joint Force to know and understand that secret sauce. The Russians manifestly do not have that. They do not have that those junior enlisted people who are willing to take initiative, who can operate when the radios don't work because they know and understand what their commanders want them to do. And we should treasure that because it is something that sets our military apart and has for many years. It makes us unique, really, among most, not all, but most of the nations of the world. And you're right. A very good example is the Russian inability to execute effectively in Ukraine compared to what the United States military is capable of doing.
Something that I'm interested in is why do you think Russia has fought in plenty of wars? They've had plenty of military interventions since the 1990s. Why did they not just develop that muscle that or even that policy objective that you're describing? Is there something structural?
I think there's something structural there that prevents them from doing it. I think whether it's a communist-based economy or a totalitarian command-based economy and political structure tends to promote obedience, promote blind obedience, doesn't reward initiative, doesn't reward people who take risks. You get blind conformity. You don't want to step out of line because the political commissar or in the case of Russia today, just the corruption that has followed in the wake of the overt politicization of the Russian military for many years. So that's a significant problem, and that's not a problem you fix overnight or even in a 1, 10, or 5 year period, 1, 5, or 10 year period. Pardon me.
So The book, when you're writing it, you're specifically writing it from a leadership perspective. I'm sort of curious. We've talked about the Russian side of things, but when it comes to the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese, future threats, deterrence, et cetera, the Chinese haven't fought a significant military operation since their failed invasion of Vietnam in 1979. And as a person who's fought through the war on terror, and then obviously like the aftermath with everything from ISIS to the withdrawal from Kabul, to what degree are the Chinese hobbled in a way that even the Russians are, because Russians have fought in wars all this century, by just not activating this muscle or participating, especially given if the Chinese are going to launch offensive operations in the South China Sea or towards Taiwan. It just seems like there's a huge gap there. So I'd like to hear how you think about that at a leadership level.
Well, I think you've hit on something very important. First of all, it's in equipment. The Chinese have got to look at their equipment now based on Russian performance, because much of their equipment has some commonality with that which the Russians have used. That's a problem they've got to re-examine. And they've also got to look at the way they've trained their people. And I think that's something that they've got to think about long and hard in the light of Russian performance. So I think in those two dimensions in particular, China's got to sort of rethink where they are, rethink their capabilities, and they will. And but organizations that are command driven, and by that I mean a totalitarian state, is probably not the best organization in the world to undertake a searching self-examination and significant change, which is probably good news for us.
Something I'm curious about, to what degree can, and this is where you could really speak from your experience, to what degree, what are the limits of the kind of like organizational and academic abilities of any force to learn things without action? So, for example, an invasion of Taiwan would be one of like the greatest maritime invasions in human history. In the U.S., when we launched D-Day, obviously we had the 80th anniversary recently. That was up to this point the greatest maritime invasion in history. But that was after 2 years of war. We went through the struggles in North Africa. You had an initially disastrous appearance during the Battle of Kasserine Pass. You had the initial struggles with the Sicily landings, then going into Italy. We just had direct experience. So I'd like for you to talk then about like the gap between, okay, so we're going to study the ways that our leadership class isn't ready. We're going to get our equipment in hand. Where does that end relative to actual experience in the field?
So you do two things: you train, and you educate. And when you train for specific circumstances, how do you how does a ship respond to a missile attack on them? How do you actually exit a landing craft? How do you fight a submarine? Those are things you can train for. But what you have to do then is educate for the unknown. And a big component of education is the study of history. So I want to talk about large-scale cross-channel invasions. Go back and spend some time looking at Overlord, Neptune, the naval component of it. That's how you do it. You need to train. And junior folks do a lot of training, some education. Senior folks need to do a lot more education and also some training. And as you get more senior, the possibility of confronting unknowns arises. And again, you don't necessarily train for that, but what you do is you educate. And education is different than training, and it's a complex process that involves a study of history. It involves trying to find analogous situations in the past from which you can draw lessons without being overly bound by those events. Look, it is an art. That the education part of it is artistic. The training part of it is more quantitative. So, and another way to say it would be the quantitative and the qualitative element. But both of those things can be done. You can do it through, as we do a lot in the Marine Corps and in the Army, through staff rides. You go examine battlefields. You look at where people had to make decisions. You put yourself into those shoes, looking at the same ground, and you try to fight it out again. And it allows you to engage in a dialectic. And I think the dialectic is very important for leader education, particularly when we're talking about new and very demanding things like the defense of Taiwan, is the example you cited.
Something I'm curious about, speaking of the Marine Corps, so you commissioned out of the Citadel in 1979, and I'm fascinated to speak with general officers from that period because in many ways you're deciding to join the military in 75, 74, if you're thinking about that in high school. That was a particular low point when it came to the U.S. military. You had the post-Vietnam hangover, you had culture wars, you had racial division, you had like huge problem with drug use. I'd like you to, and in many ways, obviously, we're not literally repeating that history today, but there are ways that today's moment rhymes with that. All of the services except the Marine Corps are struggling with recruitment. So what motivated you to commission during that 70s period, but also specifically choose the Marine Corps as your service branch?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I can give you a satisfactory answer.
Sometimes things
Even
just
today,
happen. You didn't have a perfect narrative.
no, I didn't. My family had no particular martial tradition. My father was an enlisted soldier in Korea and very proud of his service in Korea, but he went to Korea, but not a great history of it. I was fascinated by the Marine Corps. They seemed to offer, a sense of belonging to something that was bigger than yourself. They seemed to have a sense about themselves that I found attractive. I liked the physical challenge that was essential to the Marine Corps experience. And so those things sort of led me to go to a military college in South Carolina, the Citadel, and then to seek a commission in the Marine Corps. And I actually, when I went to the Citadel in summer of 1975, I knew I wanted to go in the Marine Corps. I never wavered. I never considered an alternative. I was fixed in that. And when I was commissioned in the Marine Corps in May of 1979, and then I sort of knew I wanted to be an infantry officer. I had been exposed over my 4 years at the Citadel to infantry officers, both Army and Marine, and I felt that was something that I like to be around people. I like to lead people, and as an infantryman, you have the opportunity, if you're successful, to lead increasingly larger groups of people. You're outdoors. You're in a demanding physical environment. And that's what sort of brings you at the beginning. And certainly when I was commissioned in 1979, believe me, I had no idea where I was going to end up. And those who graduated with me and those who commissioned us certainly would not have picked me to be where I was at the end of 42 years.
Something I'm curious about. What do you think in the year 2024 the Marine Corps is getting right from, and I hate to speak in terms of like marketing, but from a branding and an identity and purpose perspective when it comes, because obviously like the Marine Corps is smaller than the Army. So there's like a structural reason why it'd be easier on the face of it for it to meet its recruitment challenges. But just clearly, if you look at the numbers of recruitment missed targets from the Marine Corps, which is hitting and exceeding versus the other service arms, there's something clearly happening there. Could you talk about this?
Sure. So I would say what the Marine Corps sells is something bigger than yourself. We're not going to change because you come in the Marine Corps or don't come in the Marine Corps. If you don't come in the Marine Corps, good luck to you. Have a good life. We'll get somebody else that wants to be a Marine. So the Marine Corps doesn't bend. It adapts people to the design of the Marine Corps, and that appeals to some people. Other people it doesn't appeal to. And but what it does is it allows you to be part of an organization that has a very clear vision of its role in the world, how it's going to attain those objectives, and a strong sense of continuity of success, going back many years, fought by bloodshed on many battlefields. And again, that's not for everybody, but it worked for me, and I think it works today for young men and women who want to challenge. Who want to go into an organization that's not going to adjust itself to their particular characteristics, but in fact is going to require them to make some sacrifices and bend themselves to fit the designs of our organization. That attracts some people. Other people want to do something else, and God bless those other people. But also, I'm very proud of those who elect to come in and be Marines.
Something I'm really fascinated by, and this is why I think the Marine Corps is a fascinating branch. On the one hand, you're very clear at a like self-conception level. The Marine Corps doesn't break or bend. It knows what it is. On the other hand, though, the Marine Corps, I think more than other service arms, is having to sort of reimagine its role and function very concretely and very specifically. So, for example, I'm always fascinated by, post World War II, there's a lot of debate about like the purpose of the Marine Corps. There's a lot of talk about how, amphibious invasions aren't going to really matter. 3 years later, you're in Incheon, the Incheon landings, and that's a clear illustration of like why that matters and where that's there. But today, there's a very serious debate about the purpose of the Marine Corps post-war on terror. Tanks are gone, et cetera. So on the one hand, the branch is very sure of itself, or sorry, the service is very sure of itself, but its actual implementation of that identity is going to shift in ways. I'm curious what you think about this, especially as you focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Sure. So I would tell you that the Marine Corps, the nation, the United States, has a Marine Corps not because it has to have a Marine Corps, but because it wants a Marine Corps. You've got Army, Navy, Air Force, Space, Cyber. You have people that actually work in the various domains. The Marine Corps is a curiously amphibian creature that crosses domains, and as a result of that, it can perform unique functions. But also, as a result of that, is often insecure in its challenge. Well, why do we need 2 land armies? Why do we need 2 naval air forces? Why do we need a Marine Corps? Well, the reason is we have a Marine Corps because the American people want a Marine Corps, not because it's written in stone that militarily we need one. If the American people ever decide they don't want a Marine Corps, then the Marine Corps will go away. But I don't think that time is here now, because I think the American people know and understand the values that the Marine Corps represents and what we bring to the national ethos and what we contribute in several dimensions. First of all, and most importantly, we're capable of going out there and fighting and winning. That's very important. And second, what we contribute in terms of citizens that are returned to the nation as a result of the Marine experience and what they bring to the body politic going forward. I think there are a lot of reasons why that is very important. And that sort of actually, in many ways, it transcends any particular debate about, is the Marine Corps going to have tanks or not have tanks? How much field artillery we're going to have. The Marine Corps occupies a sacred place in the American psyche. And if it ever loses that, then the Marine Corps will go away. And I think we will be a lesser nation should that happen.
No, that's very well stated. I think I actually really like the answer of the Marine Corps exists because there's an actual, it's not that you're saying there's a political decision, but the Marine Corps is part of the, I think, civic conceptualization of what the country's armed forces look like. So that's very interesting. I want to focus to 2 big events in your CENTCOM career that I think a lot of folks are obviously going to know about. So the first one, and there's a variety of events. Obviously, you worked in the Marine Corps during a particularly notable period, but I want to zoom in on 2. So firstly, the killing / assassination of Soleimani, and then withdrawal from Kabul. So first question, I felt uncomfortable saying the word assassination there. It seems like it feels. There's something a little uncouth about the concept. I almost said killing, but I think we should just kind of be direct about these things. Can you just sort of reflect on, I think, the awkwardness of that phrasing when we're describing what happened?
Sure. So it's important to understand it's actually not awkward for me at all, because assassination is an illegal act and we don't conduct assassination. So we struck him. He was a legitimate military target who posed a clear and present danger to the United States. He was struck at the direction of the president, acting well within his authority. So there's not a question of an assassination. People can use the word, but it does not actually describe what happened. He was a legitimate target that was struck. So I'm actually very comfortable, with that phrasing. That's the phrasing I always look to use. But it was given what he was intending to do in the first week of January 2020, to wit, kill Americans. Then it became a simple question. If we did not take action against him, more Americans would have died. We took that action. We recognized there were risks that attended taking that action. There were greater risks that attended not taking that action. So we took it and we struck him. And then a week later, the Iranians hit back at us. Their blow landed largely on air. And we were able to put that episode behind us, but with a new sort of understanding on the Iranians' part about the true depth of American will.
Something that I think is really fascinating from that answer that I'd like you to talk about the legitimate military target aspect of this. Does that relate to him, not just like his objectives in terms of like killing American and allied troops in the region, but was it the fact that he was outside of Iran and he was actually in Syria or he's going into Iraq? Because something I just kind of think about is there are plenty of people in Iran with hostile intent towards the United States who are planning, executing, et cetera. But as we talk about drones, we talk about cyber attacks, et cetera, you don't actually have to be in the field to represent a threat. So how should we think through this dynamic? Because like it kind of goes to a certain degree of his like vanity, but he was jetting around in such a vulnerable way. That was an unnecessary risk on his part. If I'm his staff, I'm sort of like, whoa, like maybe we stay within our borders if we're planning attacks actively. But how do you think about this dynamic today?
Well, first of all, his security guys told him, "You're taking risks you don't need to take," but he chose not to listen to them. That's just a data point. Second, we struck him because he was a clear and present danger, and we always have the right of self-defense, and so we exercise that right. The president exercised that right by making the decision to strike him. So, perfectly lawful strike against a perfectly lawful target. Happened to be in Iraq because Iraq was where he was going to coordinate further attacks on the United States. Could have been in another place. It just happened that the attack occurred on Route Irish, which is our code name, and everybody in the region knows it, for the road out of the Baghdad International Airport, by the way, and perhaps in a sense of karma, a road upon which Qassem Soleimani is responsible for the deaths of many, many Americans. So that he died on Route Irish sort of has a certain symbolism for those of us who have followed that conflict for many years. But I will tell you that to go back to your question, legitimate target. Take him. He was actually involved in activities that would have resulted in loss of American life. So it was a pretty clear decision in that regard. The concern comes about the Iranian response and what it was going to be, and we talked about that. We argued about that as we made the decision, but the basic decision was the right decision.
Something I'm curious about, you earlier when you were talking about, giving your opinion to a commander in chief, you talked about how your job isn't to sort of talk about like wider trends and regions. Because for example, when you're using all this under a theory of deterrence, or that obviously is going to extend into how are the Iranians going to respond? Is this in fact going to deter them, or is this going to cause them to escalate? How do you think then of the balance between, once again, your expertise and going too far into sort of political or regional analysis?
So first of all, they'll tell you if they think you've gone too far. Typically, if you're in a meeting and people don't want to hear what you got to say, they're usually no one's shy about telling you that's quite enough. But I've never had that problem because I tend to be pretty circumscribed when I give my opinions on stuff like this. I've been doing it for a while, both as the commander, then as a backbencher, and as the director of the Joint Staff and the senior uniform planner for the United States as the Joint Staff J5 before that. So I'm very comfortable in this environment and how you give advice. The one thing I would say that we always talk about risk. What's the risk of this? And the one phrase I never use when I talk to political leadership is unacceptable. I never say unacceptable risk. I describe the risks. That's what I'm supposed to do. Is here's what you want to do. In my judgment, here's the risk that attends that action. Now, I may say that I think that risk may cause us to possibly lose an aircraft carrier or a number of fighter aircraft or whatever. It doesn't matter, particularly for the sake of discussion right now. And to me, that might seem a very, very high price to pay. But the president of the United States or the secretary who have a broader view than I, that may be something they're willing, that may be a risk they're willing to bear. My responsibility is to outline the risk. Their responsibility is to determine if they at the highest levels of our nation think, in fact, that's acceptable risk or not. And I would argue that the discussion of acceptable risk is not necessarily a military concept, but rather a policy concept.
Something I'm curious about then, especially I read the Atlantic excerpt of the book that focuses on the Soleimani killing, and something I took away from that was just the focus on the word deterrence. And I think as America is trying to come up with a broad civil military, everyone agrees, set of policies to approach the rest of the decade, it really is all about deterrence. It's deterring Hezbollah from escalating in the Middle East. It's deterring Iran from the same. We're deterring Russia from going further into Ukraine and into Eastern Europe. We're deterring the Chinese from taking offensive operations in the South China Sea and Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What lessons from Soleimani's death can we take from a deterrence perspective?
Sure. So first of all, let's unpack deterrence for just a minute. So deterrence is a activity in the cognitive space of the opponent, the person you're talking to, where you want to produce uncertainty in their mind about the object they want to do, the action they want to take. Is it worth the pain you're going to cause them if they take it?
Mhm.
And so really, it's more than that. You can achieve deterrence by denial. You can make it seem like I can't get there because they're too strong. That's one case of deterrence. The other case of deterrence is you can get there, but I'm going to hurt you so bad it won't be worth it. That's deterrence by punishment. Those are the two classic applications of deterrence theory. And as the opponent looks at you, they sort by what is your capability to do this, one, and second, what is your will to do this? Now, in the Iranians' case, they have always known and understood our capabilities and actually have a very good and healthy respect for U.S. capabilities. For many years, what they have not had that respect for is our will, our ability, our willingness to, screw our courage to the sticking point and actually execute. And what the Soleimani strike did was cause them to recalibrate that. So it did have an effect on them. I would argue an effect on them that has lingered kind of to this day. Although in the region, and by the region I mean the Middle East, the level of violence is so high that you have to reset deterrence fairly frequently. It tends to have a very short half-life.
Something I'm curious about. I'm going back to your discussion of risk, and I want to. Obviously, the majority of this audience is civilian minded, but in a policymaking perspective, I'd love your advice or maybe a framing you can give us when it comes to understanding the limits of American capabilities. So to your point, the Iranians respect our capabilities. We clearly were in an era during the early 21st century where it felt like we can really push the limits of what those capabilities are at a variety of levels today, budgetarily, multiple theaters, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Indo-Pacific, et cetera. It feels like we're really reaching what I think should be limits. So how should civilian policymakers adjust their objectives relative to what the military can deliver them?
So it begins at the very highest levels because that's where you set your global objectives for the United States. What are our objectives in the region, in the Middle East? What are our objectives in Europe? What are our objectives vis-a-vis China and in the Western Pacific? That's actually that's a civilian construct informed by military advice, but ultimately it's a decision made by constitutionally appointed decision makers. So they need to look at that very hard, and they need to know and understand, and they need to know how to describe it. Some people are better than others at describing it because you want to describe it in terms that are achievable. You don't want to use airy platitudes. You want to be quite specific when you describe that future. And for me, at least, you pick a time, 2 or 3, 4 years out in the future. What do we want this part of the world to look like? What do we? And then you describe it, and then you begin to see. Then you look back to where you are now, and you see the path to it, and you begin to know and understand what are the things we have to do in order to get us to that point. And do we have enough resources there to do that? And you have to have a resourcing discussion. And look, the resources aren't strictly in the Department of Defense. Department of State has a role here, the U.S. Agency for International Development, Commerce, Treasury, all of the cabinet offices of the United States have a role in this as we look at global policy for the nation as a whole. And we should avoid over-militarizing it if we can. It needs to be, the senior cabinet officer of the United States, as you know, is not the Secretary of Defense, it's the Secretary of State. And so it really should begin there with a lot of these deliberations. And I would just end by saying we should be cautious about over-militarizing the way we approach these problems.
Let's take it in this last section to the withdrawal from Kabul. So you were already CENTCOM commander, but you assumed responsibility in July of 2021. Can you explain that dynamic in terms of how it structurally worked?
Sure. So I assumed command of CENTCOM in 2019, responsible for 21 countries. One of those 21 countries was Afghanistan. But I had a very good 4-star commander in there, an Army general named Scott Miller, and he was the field commander for me on the ground there. So he made the decisions there. I was ultimately responsible for it, as was the Secretary of Defense, as was the President. But the chain of command ran Scott Miller, me, Secretary, President. And so as we drew down our forces in the summer of 2021, at some point, we became too small for a 4-star field headquarters to be there. So Scott Miller came home on 12 July. I actually flew out there, relieved him. I placed a two-star Navy admiral, a very, very good and effective two-star Navy admiral named Pete Vaisley, on the ground as my representative in Kabul. But I assumed direct command of U.S. forces Afghanistan because the NATO and the Joint Coalition Organization had gone away by then. So I was the last actual commander of our forces in Afghanistan, although I commanded from Tampa with a two-star on the ground in Kabul.
So if we look at the actual withdrawal from Afghanistan broadly, a lot of the decisions from the Doha Agreement to the troop numbers, those were specific decisions made at a civilian political level. I guess my question to ask you would be, to what degree did let's just put it pretty directly, the widely perceived failure in many respects of the U.S. withdrawal, how much of that is you run this situation back and you could have done things better, versus at a certain point you're structurally limited into what you could actually accomplish via civilian decisions that are out of your hands?
Well, and by we, I mean the United States. I don't mean the U.S. military. I mean the United States. We could have done better if on 14, 15 April, when the president announced we were going to come out of Afghanistan, if at that time we had also begun to withdraw our embassy, our U.S. citizens, and our at-risk Afghans. Instead, we waited until, remember, the military withdrawal was complete on 12 July. The government of the Kabul government really began to fall then as provincial capitals began to topple. The Taliban closed in on Kabul, but we had not actually undertaken any actions to get our embassy out, our citizens, or our at-risk Afghans. And in fact, we did not seriously begin to accomplish that until we declared a non-combatant evacuation operation on 14 August. That was a fatal decision that was made at the beginning when we decided to come out. Now, look, there's another side to that. You can make the case, and it's a reasonable case, that if you had begun to withdraw your embassy back in April and May, and your citizens and your at-risk Afghans, you might have sped up the destruction of Afghanistan. Well, I don't know. That's a counterfactual. We can argue about it till the cows come home. We do know what happens, though, when we look at the course of action we chose, and that is complete disaster. And so I would argue that it was not so much a question of poor execution, because I think our military withdrawal went very smoothly. And I think we did about as good as we could getting people out of Afghanistan, given the fact we began to do it on the 14th of August instead of the middle of April.
You know, something I'm fascinated by is the need, given the way the world looks in the 2020s, to assess accurately both like the strength and the capabilities of allies who we're backing up when we're making these decisions. So, for example, to your point about the April decision, a withdrawal in April would have clearly signaled that we have no faith in the ability of Afghanistan security forces to maintain control of the country separate from the further out provincial capitals. And therefore, there could be a world where that just makes Ashraf Ghani's fleeing in May, and you still have a debacle, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that said, when it comes to, for example, the other side of this is Ukraine. We think Kabul is going to fail in 3 days. Fall in 3 days. We are pessimistic about the state of the Ukrainian military, and issues over the next 2 years aside, we clearly underestimated them. When it comes to Taiwan, we find ourselves having to make a similar set of calculuses. So as we're wrapping here, how do you advise we make these judgments? Obviously, like the CIA and state are going to make their own evaluations, but you're on the ground, right? You're in Kabul during this period. How do we ascertain these things?
Well, here's the key point. It needs to be made by civilian leadership. Military gets an input, but in the final analysis, it needs to be made by the president or whomever's making the decision, but a constitutionally appropriate person. And that is not the U.S. military. We get to give advice. You're right. State's going to have an opinion. The intelligence community is going to have an opinion. The Secretary of Defense will weigh in. But ultimately, that decision, the military should be a junior partner in that decision making, because the president has a broader view. And even if his decision is viewed to be a wrong one, he needs to have complete confidence that those orders will be carried out. And the fact that that happens is more important than the specific nature of any individual decision.
For sure. So let's just close here. Tell me about your USF role. You're obviously in the civilian side of your career now. Let's close with what you're working on.
So I'm at the University of South Florida. I'm the executive director of the Global and National Security Institute and the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. USF's a great school. It's a very dynamic, growing university. Just received AAU membership. Big deal, and it's a great place to be. My wife and I enjoy Tampa. We like everything about it, and we particularly enjoy the association with the University of South Florida.
Great. Well, General McKenzie, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for joining me on the Realignment.
Thanks so much for having me.